Welcome to the My Favorite CPA podcast. Today is September 7th, and we have a very interesting subject today. It's something that, quite honestly, gets a lot of business people hamstrung, irritated, angry, frustrated, and confused. So hit me with a DM or better yet, message in the comments if you would like to hear more about this. The subject of the day is employees versus subcontractors. There's so much to talk about here. So many urban legends and different ways that people come at things. I'm CPA Dan Hodges. I am in a few years, I'll be a 30-year veteran of working with small business owners, family-owned businesses, and all the issues that they face, really cradle to grave. On this note, on the employee versus subcontractor issue, sometimes business owners will hear this, like an urban legend, like, oh, you don't want to do it this way, or you really should do it this way. Everyone's got an opinion on this subject. So let's delve a little bit deeper. Here's what I would like to say. I will hear business owners that come to me and say, I absolutely, hands down, I'm going to hire the people that work for me as subcontractors because I don't want to pay all those extra costs. Well, let's just get real about this for a second. Here's some things I talk about with people. Now, every situation is different. And I personally, this is my opinion, I think if you work very hard, you could probably structure just about any relationship any way you want to with enough forethought. But I want to warn you, if you're in business, there are a lot of pitfalls and potholes. And I'll try and touch on that here as we talk about it. But here in general is my rule of thumb and my gut feeling. If we are hamstrung and don't know which way to go, or if our friends have told us, or the Google has told us by way of urban legend that you got to pay everyone as a subcontractor because it's so much cheaper. I think I hear that time and again. The reality of the situation is if you have an employee on payroll, and let's just put some fictitious numbers to it. Let's say that you're paying $1,000 per pay period. If that worker were paid $1,000 per pay period, the additional costs to put someone on a W-2 payroll versus a 1099 subcontractor payment is really, in the grand scheme of things, quite small. Because if you have no benefits, because you don't offer health insurance at this time, and you don't offer this and that, and all this stuff that big companies can offer. If it's just, look, it's a job for a paycheck. The additional cost to you as the employer, I would budget roughly an extra 10%. And here's where that comes from. In employee and employer land, and this, by the way, is also a whole subject I could go off on a tangent about, the additional costs that an employer has that are absolute, you can't bypass these. It would be FICA tax and unemployment tax. Those are two costs that you would have on employees that just no matter how you do it, you're going to have. So what is the rate for FICA tax? Well, FICA is an interesting subject because the employer pays half and the employee pays half. The total combined rate is actually 15.3%. Now, 15.3%, that might not sound familiar to many folks. And that's because if you've been an employee all these years and you've looked at your pay stub, you're paying half as an employee. You're paying half. You're paying 7.65%. And by the way, for some of you that are like engineers and mathematics experts, you might correct me or send me a message and break it out. It's actually 6.2% for Social Security tax and 1.45% for Medicare tax. So, I said that's the employee side. Now, I also said earlier that the FICA tax is split in half. The employer pays half and the employee pays half. So if you're following me here, what we're talking about is the additional cost for the employer beyond the $1,000 per pay period would be an additional 7.65% of the Social Security and Medicare employer portion or the matching portion. So to put some, some numbers to that, $1,000 times 0.0765, $76.50. That's the math that we're talking about. So some business owners will get it stuck in their mind that I can't do whatever it is they can't do because it's going to cost me so much extra. But $76.50 on $1,000. Plus you have your unemployment tax, which for quick figuring purposes, I like to think between the FICA tax and the other costs there, let's just say budget an extra 10%. So if you are paying someone $1,000 in a pay period, the additional cost, just roughly and not very accurately and precisely, would be an extra $100 per pay period. It's not a lot that's going to break most people. But let's talk a little bit more about how this is viewed in a modern era. So I brought up just a Google document, and I have both the IRS and some other sites that we could look at, but the source that I'm referencing is just random. It's not authoritative. I think it's actually potentially a law firm. What they're talking about here's the things that the government would look if there was some conflict. And when would conflict arise? Well, it would occur if you had a worker that's no longer working for you anymore and they're mad. And they call 1-800-TELL-DOL. I don't think that's a real phone number, but DOL stands for Department of Labor. So if you had an employee who is upset about something and they have an axe to grind, and I said employee, they could report to the government, and there's a formal reporting process. They could just fill out a form saying, I think I was wrongly treated. I was treated as a subcontractor when I should have been an employee. And once that report gets filed, you're going to get a flurry of paperwork coming in your inbox. It's probably going to start with Department of Labor. It ultimately is probably going to end with IRS wanting to talk to you. If IRS wants to talk to you, they would want, if it's determined that that worker in reality, in actuality, was really an employee rather than a subcontractor, they would want to collect now the FICA tax, the Social Security, the Medicare, and the unemployment. And they have some strong power. They could actually significantly increase the amount that you owe. They could ask you to pay the employees withholding taxes for federal, state, FICA, social, and the employer taxes, and the Department of Labor could hit you with a huge fine. So when you compare all that to the little bit it might cost you extra to treat someone as an employee, if you're just not sure, where do you think the safe harbor is? So let's verbally walk through some of the tests and how the government would look at this situation. First, the question would be: so this worker, do you tell them where to go, what to do, when to do it, and how to do it? Because if you tell them, then the situation sounds much more like an employee than a subcontractor. A subcontractor on the flip side, what they would do is probably provide you a bid, which you would accept, and then they would send you an invoice, which you would pay when you get the invoice. They would tell you, this is how we're going to do it, this is when we're going to do it, and so on. So can you start to see employee land versus subcontractor land? They have a different feeling. Another thing that the government could look at in an investigator situation is, does the individual who's doing work, do they receive training on how to do the job from you? Or do they already have the training and just know what to do because they are in the business of doing that work? Another thing that they potentially might look at is the success or the continuation of your business somewhat reliant on the worker that's doing the work? Because if you're heavily reliant on them, does it sound more like a subcontractor or does it sound more like an employee? Another thing that they might look at is whether the person that you're paying must personally, individually perform the services. Because if they do, it could sound more like an employee relationship as compared to a subcontractor relationship where they might have a team. Next would be how you have dealt with other workers in the past. Are they typically employees? Are they typically subcontractors? If you're hiring someone to clean your furnace, probably not an employee, especially if it's like a one-off situation. Probably not an employee. Could be, but probably not. Another thing that they might look at is what is the continuing relationship here between, the company hiring the work done and the worker. If it's continuing and ongoing, that could be a clue or a sign that is more an employee relationship versus a subcontractor relationship. Also, if there is a requirement that the worker must work an established number of hours, like 40 hours a week, does that sound more like an employee relationship or more like a subcontractor relationship? There's other things that we would look at here. Again, it would be things like, does this individual work full-time at your company? Because if you have someone working full-time for you and you alone, does that sound more like an employee or does that sound more like a subcontractor? Another factor to look at in an investigation, or if you're trying to make a determination here, might be something like, does this work have to be performed in person and on company premises? Because if that's the case, that might lead you to this person sounds more like an employee than a subcontractor. Another factor would be if the work must follow an exact, precise sequence or routine. If you are coming in, you're flipping burgers, and first you have to do the prep work at 5 a.m., and then, the grind all the beef and chop all the onions and that kind of stuff, and then mash them into patties. Could be indicative of an employee versus a subcontractor. Not one of these alone would be a nail in the coffin, but in a situation where you're trying to make a determination or where there's some government oversight on this, they will be looking at a lot of different factors in the relationship. Really anymore, it's about who has the control. Does the person paying the bill have the preponderance of control on who, what, when, where, why, how? Or does the worker? Other indicators could be things like, what kind of reporting do you get on the work that is done? An employee may give you a certain level of accountability, high accountability, versus a subcontractor may just do the job, and when it's done, you find out. Also, one factor to consider, and here again, none of these individually are necessarily determinative, but if you are paying somebody by the hour or by the week or by the month, that could be indicative of an employee relationship versus a subcontractor relationship. Next would be if there's travel costs or out-of-pocket expenses. With an employee, they're much more likely to say, I need reimbursed for my mileage, or I need reimbursed for my hotel, or that kind of stuff. Whereas with a subcontractor, that could be a little bit different. Agreed? Next, we have things like, does the company supply the worker with tools, materials, and resources, or does the worker bring their own? One sounds more like an employee, and the other sounds more like a subcontractor. You may want to take a look at the level of investment. An employee has a level of an investment where a subcontractor brings their own tools, their own technology, their own equipment, their own, processes and programs. It's a very differing level of investment, and that may be an indicator that helps you decide on this. And then as we wrap this up here with the last few things, does this worker have the ability to suffer a loss? If you're hourly, you're probably not going to lose money. Whereas if you're an independent contractor, if it takes too many hours, that could lead to a situation where, man, I've worked 2,000 hours for 20 bucks. That could be indicative of a subcontractor relationship versus an employee relationship. Other factors would be like, does the individual only perform services for your company? As compared to, maybe a subcontractor would be, I'm performing the services and here's the raw material and so on and so forth. Does the individual limit their availability of their services to the general public? If you're a subcontractor, you're typically working for company A, company B, company C, company D, company E, company F, and so on. When you're an employee, you tend to work for one and only one, maybe a side gig. Number 19, that would also be indicative of who has the control in the relationship. In an employee-employer relationship, an employee can quit at any time for any reason in many states. Here in my home state, this is called an at-will work state. If you want to quit, and you're done. But in a subcontractor relationship, we have a contract. We have an agreement. You must do the work. We agreed to it. I'm going to pay you, and you're going to do the work. And then lastly on our list of things to talk about today is along the same lines, if it's just really who has the control in the relationship. So these are the things that would be looked at in a employee versus subcontractor controversy. These are the things that you want to think about as you're structuring any relationship. And one last thing to think about, I'm going to add this to the list we've been talking about here. Typically a subcontractor will have things like business cards, an invoice, and that kind of stuff. Whereas an employee has a time card that they punch, and they give you a W-4 saying how much tax to withhold, and you withhold the taxes and send them a paycheck. So, and I did leave one thing out that I wanted to say, which is about contracts. Sometimes people will think about an employment contract, and maybe if we construct this a written document that says, I agree to be an employee or I agree to be a subcontractor, sometimes business owners will think, well, if I have a written contract, that's all we need. And nothing, folks, could be further from the truth. And that's exactly why these factors exist and why, government looks into these situations. So I think at the end of the day, you could probably construct any relationship just about the way you wanted. You just have to be mindful of all these different factors and construct the relationship the way you want. And I'll kind of wrap up by saying something my dad used to say. If it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And if it doesn't, walk, quack, smell, talk like a duck, it's probably not.